So, is India still rising? This was the topic that was set with a question mark, and my answer to that very shortly is it is still rising in a very remarkable and fundamental way, and it is a rising that will, in my view, continue. That's the headline. Now, nobody should represent that India is an easy country or an easy country to get things done, or is a country that is anything other than a very large, genuine democracy of great diversity. As I say, a kaleidoscopic nation of color, movement, and everything you can think of under the sun. Always a great, entertaining place to visit, to watch, to listen, meet people, and it is a wonderful country. Everybody knows that India has lots of problems, shortcomings, deficiencies, confusions, so we should get over that. I acknowledge all that. And yet I am extremely positive. So I'd like to explain why. And I think my experience there was long enough and over a unique period which enables me to have the views that I'm going to express. Plus, since then, I have been in constant contact with investors around the world whom I see a great deal of my time. I do some investment banking, but I do a lot of work with hedge funds and international investors of various kinds and so on. And these are, populated by smart people who ask a lot of questions and put you on the spot on things. So I get a lot of practice, and I get a lot of chance to think about things. And then I go to India 2 or 3 times a year. My wife had breast cancer when she was there, and was cured. And then when she came back, she initiated the first Walk for Life for Cancer Awareness in New Delhi in 2008. So we go back each year for that because she leads the walk, and this is a major event in her life, and for both of us. So let's just go back and make sure we're on the same wavelength on India's past. Not too much history, but some. 1947, India was formed, and for the years between 47 and 2003, it never grew faster than 2.5% to 4.5%, with exceptions where it touched 5 but never sustained 5%. Meanwhile, the population in 1947 was 300,000. By 2000 or so, it was 1.1 or 1.2 billion. So I always say the 2 main products of India's first 60 years were, first of all, poverty, because it didn't grow fast enough to take care of its population growth, and secondly, democracy, most remarkably, to have created a genuine democracy of the type India has after partition and the violence that took place at that time. Everything morphed over the years into a truly democratic society. It is a chaotic place, that's true, but it is very stable. So if you can fit those things together, then you can begin to understand India. Until 1991, when the reforms began under Manmohan Singh, India was a very closed economy, a sort of import substitution economy, not really very open to the world at large, and it regarded itself as the sort of self-appointed leader of the non-aligned world in those years. I was at Treasury in many of those years, and I used to have to meet Indian delegations, and they were always on the other side of issues from us in the United States. And the relationship with India, between the U.S. and India, was very up and down over those years. And the Gandhi dynasty, if you want to call it that, was very, very paternalistic in its view of policy towards rural India, where 80% of the people lived. And it gave them a different view of the world and made it hard to cooperate I think in the United Nations it was rare, actually, for India to support the United States in votes over those years. And yet after 1991, when India began its reforms, things began to change. First of all, the reforms initially were more in the nature of opening India to the world than they were internal structural reforms. And the opening process was something India was really forced to do at that time because of its financial situation. And gradually, they began to show some signs of stronger growth, although they had coalition governments during the 90s. But the great setback in that period came when India tested its nuclear weapon in 1998, and as a result drew sanctions from the United States and many other countries around the world. These sanctions were very punitive, and they were very embarrassing to India militarily, because India imports most of its weapons, and many of those weapons became unusable or difficult to service because they had dual-use parts and et cetera covered by sanctions. The sanctions were lifted by George W. Bush in 2001, and within 1 year there had been the Pakistani attack on the Indian Parliament, which took place early in 2002, and all of these events disrupted India's continuity and undermined to some extent its capacity to really establish higher growth levels. So the first year that growth really penetrated and was sustained above 5% was 2003. So that is the year I date, quote unquote, the modern Indian economy from. And I think this is a very important distinction when you look at India's prospects, because they really date in a major way from then. In those years, 03, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, growth went from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 9, 10+%. And India really enjoyed a major breakout. And the reforms began to be more than just opening to the world. They began to be internal reforms that were promoting growth or assisting growth. There was a lot of slowness there, a lot of difficulty, but these things did begin to happen. In the United States, George W. Bush made an initiative in 2005 of extreme importance in terms of its so-called strategic relationship with India, which is what George Bush wanted, and which we were dedicated to try to achieve in a major way. When the United States agreed to negotiate with India a civil nuclear agreement that would restore India's access to global civil nuclear technology, even though it had not signed the 1974 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. Under that treaty, a country that hadn't signed it couldn't have nuclear weapons. If it wanted to sign the treaty and gain access to global civil nuclear technology, it had to give up its nuclear weapons. India had developed its own nuclear weapons. China had nuclear weapons. Pakistan had nuclear weapons. And therefore, their view was they wouldn't and couldn't give up the weapons. And George W. Bush took the view, we better be on the right side of history, accept this, and negotiate an agreement with them that would establish this access once again after 35 years of isolation. And that was regarded as the most important diplomatic act in India of the past 50 years. It took us 3.5 years to negotiate that agreement. It was successfully concluded in October of 2008, and India enjoys the position among all nations, about number 6 outside of the big 5, where it has nuclear weapons, hasn't signed the treaty, has access to full civil nuclear technology. It's a very rare and privileged position. And India's game plan, which it hasn't executed yet, was to build its own expanded civil nuclear industry so that it could depend more on civil nuclear generated electric power and avoid becoming the world's greatest polluter after China. So it was a very important political goal for them. Anyway, that background, I think, is very important to understand. Because what happened in the next years after that, and this is, I think, what one has to try to come to understand as to why I feel so positive about India's progress, is that in those breakout years, especially in the years of 07, 06, 07, 08, a remarkable phenomenon took place, and that was that India established mobile telecom coverage of the entire country in a short space of about 3 years. In a country of 800,000 villages and 70 to 80% of the people living in rural areas in an agricultural economy setting, many of the people subsistence level people, to accomplish that step was something of a miracle. And it happened, as I said, in 3 quick years. At the same time, the Congress-led government exercised its usual philosophy of paternalistic policies and distributed lots of money and subsidies and so on into rural India, which was their habit going way back. So fertilizer subsidies, food subsidies, 100 days of work, a variety of different policies. And the effect of these two things was remarkable because it created, for the first time, among Indian rural families, their first ever slice of disposable income. And they began to spend on simple, fast-moving consumer goods. But this gave real energy to the economy, and moreover, it raised expectations of people. Indians have very high expectations for themselves and their children, and they're prepared to work and seek out opportunities. And this change enabled that process to really begin to take off, a sort of revolution in expectations. And at the time, I identified this as the transformative event of that decade, because rural India was beginning to be transformed, which had never happened before. And by having mobile telecom coverage, they skipped an entire generation of investment in fixed line coverage in the normal fashion. So huge amounts of infrastructure were simply frog leaped into the future. And in the years after I got there, when rural India was very rural still, as I traveled around, all of a sudden there began to be handsets appearing in the hands of everybody, farmers, women in the villages, kids, and they were very simple sets, about $11 to buy, almost free to use, and very sort of primitive in a way. But they really struck a chord and people bought them. And then that was followed by the next government of Manmohan Singh, 5 more years, when momentum and growth was lost, and India fell back to about a 5.5% growth rate over those years. And people began to question India's momentum and progress. Its growth no longer was at 10%. It wasn't a leading player among emerging markets. It was falling into a lesser category. And there was a lot of criticism of the government. The second administration of Manmohan Singh lacked momentum, continuity, and decisiveness. And it began to be a situation where people were really very, very concerned. And into that situation is when Modi emerged as a major political player. He was the governor of the state of Gujarat, had been very successful there for 12 years, the highest growth rate in India, the highest foreign and direct investment rate in India. And he himself had some problems in 2002 that were still haunting him, in riots that took place in 2002. But he was very much a chief minister of his state. But people began to thirst for a chief executive. If you talk to people, they'd say, well, I don't know if I trust Modi. Maybe he's a Hindu nationalist. Maybe he'll divide the communities, et cetera, et cetera. But we need a chief executive, somebody who really runs this place and gets us back on the track. And that is how he got elected. Rather quickly, he moved to spokesman of the BJP and then candidate for prime minister, and he won the election in a very significant way with an absolute majority, which was not seen in India for something like 20 years, at least. So that was a moment of extreme importance. It was followed then, since then, by India's current situation. And this is where one has to really focus judgment on what is happening and what Modi is or isn't achieving. There's been a lot of criticism by economists, media people, political commentators, and so on about Modi coming in and then not doing enough of the right things and losing momentum and not following through on the things that he should be doing and even on the things he said he would do. And all of that has an element of truth in it. But I think what's involved here is a failure to really look at what is happening in India. And that's what I'd like to spend the next few minutes on before we open up to questions, because it is the kernel of the question, is India still rising? First of all, Modi took office, and first he went to Japan, China, and Brazil. No prime minister had ever gone to foreign countries in his first 3 weeks in office. And he announced a few weeks later a new foreign policy for India. It was that India would no longer just be a balancing factor in global diplomacy, it would be a promoter of initiatives in global diplomacy. And he'd gone to these 3 very important countries. He hadn't called Mr. Obama or come to Washington. He'd done what he thought was the important things to do. And he then, instead of doing the kind of things a leader does to be measured in his first 100 days in office, and nothing happens in 100 days in India anyway. So he avoided that. He didn't get trapped in that. He simply disappeared in a way, and in his first budget, which was in July that year, he didn't do what everybody thought he would do, kind of amend it and reform it and promote it with BJP ideas and so on. He just made a few twerks to it and then went ahead with it. Instead, he introduced some very visionary ideas. And these ideas I just want to convey to you, because you can read about all the economics and commentators' of views anywhere if you have that interest. He introduced what seems a very simple idea, which was that every Indian should have a bank account. Now, in our country, nobody cares about that because everybody has bank accounts, too many often. But in India, it's not true because Indians don't trust banks. They save on their arms, gold under their mattress, wherever. They do not use banks. So the penetration rate of banks is very low in India. But he introduced this idea, especially for women, who are the head of the household and make the spending decisions in Indian families. So he wanted them in particular to have a bank account. Now, what he meant by a bank account was not a normal bank account. It was what you would call a payment account or a payment platform. And that is an account, small, from which you can make money transfers electronically to another account. If you think of that simple idea where an amount of money is sent electronically and received almost immediately, and it is the same amount, you're addressing a problem which for generations in India has been a real problem and has undercut trust in banks, namely Indians working in urban India, transferring money to family in rural India, were constantly being ripped off. The different amounts of money would arrive, cash would be taken out, cash changed hands. It was a very awkward system, so there was a lack of any kind of confidence in the distribution system. And yet people had to transfer money to relatives because there's great distances involved. And frankly, they had a bad experience for generations, not just shortly, but for generations. So here was an idea that would allow a family or a person working in urban India to transfer an amount of money and be assured that it got there. Very big idea. Secondly, he made the same decision on the transfer of monies for the gigantic distribution of subsidies in India, government subsidies. He announced that they were going to be transferred electronically and not in the form of cash, where, according to the figures, 30 to 35% of those transfers of subsidies were leaking, being lost or taken by corrupt players in the system. And people had said when he was elected, well, he's going to have to kick the teeth in of his people who elected him, the rural farmers, by cutting their subsidies. He didn't do that. He instead addressed the question of leakage in the system, which helped the fiscal accounts and didn't cut the subsidy of the recipient, but improved the delivery of that money. Now, there's a third part of this, and that is that he announced that there was going to be licenses given for this activity. And the licenses were distributed, and some banks applied and won a license. But who also won a license were two of the big telecom companies. So why did they want a license? Because they could see that in this system, the simple primitive handset wasn't going to serve anymore. They would need to develop more complex and sophisticated handsets to allow people to do things online. And this is a way to overcome the distances and the infrastructure difficulties of India. And it was, in my view, a brilliant idea which will promote, and is promoting already, the development of e-commerce in India. And this raises a very interesting point. I was in India about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I was speaking to one of the companies that is engaged in this, and I said to them, how does it work when you have a 45% literacy rate in many parts of India to use a more sophisticated handset? Because he was talking about how there was training going from the top down and so on. I said, what about all these illiterate people? What happens to more sophisticated handset use? And the answer was striking. He said, you'd be surprised that people who are illiterate are able to use that kind of a handset as effectively as anybody else. They overcome the literacy difficulties by learning how to use the functions on the handset. So, you know, this is a revolutionary breakthrough, because it means that India will be going online much faster than anybody would have expected, and that is indeed what's happening. The other piece of this picture began before Modi came to power, when a man named Hanan Nikalani was asked by the government to serve as a minister to create a program of identity cards for Indians. And this was undertaken, I think it was about 5 years ago, maybe it was when I was in India. And this is an iris ID system, so completely accurate. And they have been issuing cards on a nonstop basis. And I'm told they're up around 1 billion now. And these cards, a person in a village can take his card to his green grocer. He may have a bank account in a bank 100 miles away. Give the card to the green grocer. The green grocer identifies him in 4 seconds accurately and can fund him with a withdrawal from his account. The debit is then created in the bank. So here again, you don't need branches in every one of 800,000 villages to run the system. So these kinds of changes and others, such as, for example, when I was there this past month, I interviewed companies that are working on paperless transactions. And these are obviously startup companies, great investment opportunities, maybe. But what they bring is a future of efficient economic transactions. And like I said before on the telephone lines, fixed line telephones, India may leapfrog a whole generation of credit cards and credit card bureaucracies that are entrenched in our system and they may move straight to a more modern system. So there's a couple of examples of what is going on in India that I think distinguishes India at this point in time in a very major way. There are many other examples, but we can talk about them later if you'd like to delve into them. For the purpose of this point, I would like to say that when I tell people about India, they say to me, would you invest? Should we invest? It's a difficult place to invest for a whole lot of other reasons. The complexities and rules of the bureaucracy, the restrictions on sectoral investments, and so on. But what I say to people is, today India is the leading growing country among all emerging markets. When it was growing at 10%, China was growing at 12%. Today, China's growing at, if you believe any figures, 6 or 6.5. Other people say 4, 4.5. But I can tell you one thing about China. Their adjustment is not going to be, their reform process, their reform adjustments are not going to be accomplished in a short period of time. They are very complex politically and very hard to carry out. I foresee difficulties in China lasting over, say, 5 or 6 years. This means that the tortoise which passed the hare will occupy the leading position among emerging market countries for a considerable period of years. Add to the fact that India imports 72, 73% of its oil, and oil prices are down, a pure gift to Mr. Modi and the Indian economy. Consider the fact that this year was the best monsoon since 1954, I'm told. And a good monsoon means cheaper food prices, and that means lower inflation in India. So India's tendency for inflation is going to be reduced. And when that happens, the central bank will cut rates. And when they cut rates, you will see stronger domestic investment-led growth. So if you put all that together, in my view, you're looking at a long-term position where India is really going to continue to grow. I hate to say it this way, but also almost in spite of itself, because the rural economic transformation that is going on has real dynamism about it. And I believe that analysts, economic analysts, and media analysts, and so on, they don't know how to measure this dynamism, how to get your hands around 800,000 villages and individual activity, and the growth of banking services and the types of things I've been talking about. I see a country that is going to grow at 7 to 8%, possibly higher over the next 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years, and will, as it grows, of course, enjoy the benefits of a rising GDP value and standard of living and so on. Now, there's problems, we all know. Better education, absolutely vital. More jobs have to be created. Everybody knows that. Those are real challenges for Mr. Modi. But the dynamic is there. And so that's the basis of my thoughts on that. So rather than go on and make other examples, I thought I might just open up with you and we could talk about these or any other international issues you care to raise. Because it's that the Indians want. And I don't think you have to meet a sort of global standard. India remains a very peaceful country. It has very large and divided populations, very little in the way of radicalization in those various communities. And there's one other feature of India that I'd like to draw your attention to that I didn't mention, and that is that when Modi came to power, one of the first things he did was scrap the Planning Commission. They had a planning commission, Soviet style, for all the years since independence, and he scrapped it from one day to the next. And the planning commission was very powerful in India. And one of its jobs was to adjudicate the distribution of financial resources between federal and state projects. So they had a really heavy hand in the manipulation of that process. Once he abolished it, he then began to push more money into the states. We've done quite a lot of research on this, and we show a faster rise of spending in the states of India than in the federal government. I suspect he began to do that because he wanted to use that to win state elections so he could influence his position in Parliament positively. But that hasn't worked very well because he hasn't won elections very easily, at all, hardly. And there's more elections to come. But one of the effects of this is dramatic. When I got to India and I went around and met chief ministers and governors in the various states, every one of them was sort of 80 plus. They were dressed in traditional style. They were kind of old boys from Congress politics in the rural areas and so on. But within a few years, this began to change, and younger people started moving into state politics. And once the money started coming in, the result is that a lot of people in state politics are working their way, first of all, into better state performance, which I think is Modi's intention, to create more competition among states in the hope that another 4 or 5 become mini Gujarats, which will create more jobs and better incomes and so on. And the distribution of these resources is very, very important. And one of the reasons it works so quickly is that under the Indian Constitution, the distribution of powers between the states and the federal government is clearly defined. It's all in writing, all in black and white in 1947. It's not like the United States where we have to go to the Supreme Court to figure out states versus federal. All this stuff is there. State responsibilities, federal responsibilities, shared responsibilities. So these guys who come into politics, they got it in black and white what they can do. Education, roads, water, electricity, whatever it is. And they're getting the resources to do it. So it seems to me that politics is going to change substantially in India, and there's going to be a significant increase in growth, job creation, and so on, especially with the favorable factors I mentioned earlier of declining inflation, continued lower oil prices, and so on. So I just have a very optimistic view of that, and I don't think they need to meet the standard of middle income that somebody in the World Bank thinks is important. I don't think it matters if you're an Indian in an Indian village and just trying to get ahead.
The reason I asked